On a bitter Wyoming morning in 1866, 81 soldiers sprint after 10 Lakota warriors, sure they're about to win. Then, out of the snow, 2,000 Indian fighters ambush them, arrows slicing the air. In just 40 minutes, every soldier lies dead. Captain William Fetterman, their leader, gets blamed, accused of boasting he could crush the Sioux with 80 men. But was he really that reckless? Or did someone rewrite history to tarnish his name? That brutal ambush didn't happen in a vacuum. Let's step back to the mid-1860s, a time when America was raw and restless. The Civil War had just ended, leaving the country battered. Families were desperate to leave the scars of war behind, and for many, the answer lay west. In 1863, word spread like wildfire. Gold had been found in Virginia City, southern Montana. Thousands of prospectors, dreamers, and drifters packed their bags, chasing riches. To get to those gold fields, the fastest route was the Bozeman Trail. It stretched from Fort Laramie in Wyoming, cut through the northeast corner of the state, and snaked past the Bighorn Mountains into Montana. This wasn't just any stretch of land. It was called Absaroka, home to the Crow people for generations. But by the 1860s, the Crow were being pushed out. The Lakota and Cheyenne, fierce and battle-hardened, had taken over, claiming the rolling hills and buffalo herds as their own. The U.S. Army saw the flood of settlers on the Bozeman Trail and knew trouble was coming. In 1866, they built 3 forts to keep the peace: Fort Reno, Fort C.F., Smith, and the biggest of them all, Fort Phil Kearny. Smack in the heart of Wyoming, Fort Phil Kearny was no small outpost. By July 1866, it housed between 400 and 700 soldiers, officers' families, and civilian workers. The Army thought these forts would be safe havens, places to restock supplies and protect wagon trains. General William Sherman even told officers to bring their wives and kids, expecting a cushy assignment. But the Lakota had other plans. In June 1866, the U.S. government invited Lakota chiefs, led by Red Cloud, to Fort Laramie for a treaty talk. The goal was to secure safe passage for settlers on the Bozeman Trail. Red Cloud took one look at the Army's wagons rolling in, loaded with troops and supplies, and saw the truth. The U.S. wasn't asking permission. They were moving in. Furious, Red Cloud and his warriors walked out, vowing to attack anyone who set foot on their land. That was the spark of Red Cloud's war, a bloody fight to drive settlers out of the Powder River country. By December 1866, the forts were under siege. Lakota and Cheyenne raiders struck hard and fast, targeting wagon trains, woodcutters, and lone soldiers. In just 6 months, over 150 settlers and soldiers were killed along the Bozeman Trail. Leaving Fort Phil Kearny without an armed escort was a death sentence. The stage was set for a clash that would shock the nation, and it all came to a head on that fateful December morning. So who were the men caught in this powder keg at Fort Phil Kearny? The fort wasn't just a wooden stockade. It was a pressure cooker of personalities, each with their own strengths, flaws, and ambitions. Let's meet the 4 key players whose decisions shaped that deadly December day. First up, Colonel Henry B.C. Carrington, the man in charge. Carrington was a lawyer by trade, sharp as a tack, but he'd never seen a battlefield. During the Civil War, while others fought, he was back east, organizing recruits and pushing papers. In July 1866, he rolled into Wyoming with the 18th U.S. Infantry to build Fort Phil Kearny from scratch. He brought his wife, Margaret, and their kids, setting up a family home in the middle of a war zone. Carrington was a planner, obsessed with details. He mapped out the fort's defenses, stockpiled supplies, and wrote glowing reports to his bosses. But his men saw him differently. They called him cautious, even timid. The Lakota were hitting the fort daily, yet Carrington kept delaying attacks, saying he needed more horses, more men, more time. That hesitation drove a wedge between him and his officers, and it set the stage for trouble. Next, Captain William J. Fetterman, the man history remembers as the Fall Guy. Fetterman was a Civil War hero, a battle-tested officer who'd marched with General Sherman to the sea. He'd led men through gunfire, earning a brevet promotion to lieutenant colonel for bravery. When he arrived at Fort Phil Kearny in November 1866, he was stunned. The recruits were green, barely able to load their muskets. Fetterman got to work, drilling them every day until they could shoot straight. After a skirmish in early December cost 2 soldiers' lives, he told his superiors this wasn't like the Civil War. Indian warfare was up close, hand to hand, and it demanded caution. But Fetterman was no desk officer. He itched for action. He pitched a bold plan to Carrington. Take 60 cavalry and 40 armed civilians, ride to the Tongue River, and hit the Lakota villages hard. Carrington shot it down, saying it would burn through the fort's horses and supplies. Fetterman's frustration grew, and whispers started that he was too eager, maybe even reckless. Then there's Captain Frederick H. Brown, the fort's quartermaster. Brown was a firebrand, always chasing Lakota warriors who stole the fort's cattle and horses. He was set to leave Fort Phil Kearny in a few days, but he had one last goal: to kill an Indian warrior and take his scalp as a trophy. Carrington liked Brown, praising how he followed orders to the letter. But Brown had a darker side. He told anyone who'd listen that he'd rather put a bullet in his own head than let the Lakota take him alive. That wasn't just talk. It was a promise that would haunt the battlefield. Finally, Lieutenant George W. Grummond, the wild card. Grummond was another Civil War veteran, but his record was messy. He'd been chewed out repeatedly for rash decisions, charging into fights without thinking. At Fort Phil Kearny, he led the mounted infantry, a small group of cavalry. On the 6th of December, 1866, he chased a handful of Lakota raiders, only to stumble into an ambush that nearly killed him. Carrington had to yell at him to follow orders or get back to the fort. Grummond's wife, Frances, was at the fort, pregnant and worried sick. That personal pressure weighed on him, making him unpredictable. His men respected his courage, but knew he could be a loose cannon. These 4 men, Carrington, Fetterman, Brown, and Grummond, were on a collision course. Their clashing personalities, from Carrington's caution to Grummond's impulsiveness, turned Fort Phil Kearny into a tinderbox. One spark was all it would take to set it off. By late 1866, Fort Phil Kearny wasn't just a fort, it was a fortress under fire. From July to December, Lakota and Cheyenne warriors launched over 50 raids, hitting anything that moved outside the stockade. Soldiers guarding cattle, civilians cutting wood, even kids fetching water. Nobody was safe. The attacks were relentless, sometimes 3 or 4 a week, leaving the fort's men jumpy and exhausted. Every trip beyond the walls meant rolling the dice with death. The pressure wasn't just coming from outside. Inside the fort, things were boiling over. General Phillips and George Cook, Carrington's boss, had ordered a winter campaign. The idea was simple: hit the Lakota and Cheyenne now, when their ponies were weak from sparse winter grass. It was a solid plan on paper, but Carrington wasn't budging. He told Cook the fort was low on supplies, short on horses, and barely holding together. He wanted to hunker down, finish building the fort, and wait for reinforcements. To Carrington, going on the offensive was a gamble he couldn't afford. He wrote to Cook, claiming he was perfecting all details of the post and preparing for active movements, but his men saw through it. To them, he was stalling, and the delay was costing lives. That hesitation lit a fuse among the officers. Fetterman and Brown were the loudest. Fetterman, fresh off his Civil War victories, couldn't stand sitting still while raiders picked off his men. He'd seen what the Lakota could do in that December skirmish, where 2 soldiers died, and he wanted to take the fight to them. Brown was even more gung-ho. With his transfer looming, he was desperate for one big score, a chance to bag an Indian warrior before he left. Together, they pushed Carrington for action, arguing the fort had enough men to strike. Other officers, like Grummond, quietly sided with them, tired of playing defense. The rift grew wider every day. Carrington's caution felt like cowardice to men who'd faced bullets before, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. One routine task kept the fort on edge: the daily wood train. 5 miles west, in a place called the Pinery, soldiers and civilians chopped lumber for fuel and to build the fort's walls. It was critical work, but it was a magnet for trouble. The Lakota knew the wood train's schedule and hit it like clockwork. By December, every trip needed a heavy escort, sometimes up to 90 soldiers, nearly a quarter of the fort's strength. Even then, the raiders would swoop in, fire a few arrows, steal a horse, and vanish before anyone could react. The wood train wasn't just a chore. It was a daily test of survival, and everyone knew the next attack could be the big one. As the 21st of December, 1866 dawned, Fort Phil Kearny was a fort at its breaking point. The Lakota were circling, the officers were bickering, and the wood train was rolling out again. All it would take was one wrong move to turn tension into tragedy. The 21st of December, 1866, started like any other day at Fort Phil Kearny, but it was about to become a bloodbath. Around 11 a.m., signalmen on Pilot Hill waved their flags frantically. The wood train, 5 miles away at the Pinery, was under attack. The wagons had circled up, fighting off Lakota raiders. Inside the fort, the alarm bell rang and Colonel Carrington snapped into action. He needed a relief force, fast, to save the wood train before it was overrun. Carrington picked Captain William Fetterman to lead the mission. Fetterman, the battle-hardened Civil War vet, was given 50 infantrymen, mostly from his own company. Lieutenant George Grummond, the impulsive cavalry leader, volunteered to take 27 troopers from the mounted infantry. At the last minute, Captain Frederick Brown, the scalp-hungry quartermaster, insisted on joining, itching for a fight before his transfer. 2 civilians, Isaac Fisher and James Wheatley, also stepped up. They weren't ordinary volunteers. Both carried 1860 Henry repeating rifles, cutting-edge weapons that could fire 12 to 15 rounds without reloading, a game-changer in a firefight. All told, the relief force numbered 81 men. Over 30 of them seasoned Civil War veterans. On paper, it was a solid crew, but trouble was brewing. Before they left, Carrington laid out his orders, and he was crystal clear. To Fetterman, he said, "Support the wood train, relieve it, and report back to me. Do not engage or pursue the Indians at its expense. Under no circumstances pursue over Lodge Trail Ridge." That ridge, a steep, snow-dusted hill north of the fort, was a line in the sand, marked on every map in the fort. Carrington knew chasing raiders beyond it could spell disaster. As Grummond saddled up, Carrington shouted from the stockade's sentry walk, "Report to Fetterman! Obey his orders! And do not leave him." The words were sharp, a reminder of Grummond's reckless streak. But here's the problem. Carrington's orders were vague on how to relieve the wood train. Should they charge straight to the Pinery? Flank the attackers? It was up to Fetterman to decide, and that wiggle room would prove deadly. Fetterman didn't waste time. Instead of heading west toward the wood train, he led his men north, hugging the southern slope of Lodge Trail Ridge. His plan was smart. Get behind the Lakota attacking the wood train, cut them off, and break the assault. Carrington himself later admitted it was a wise move. Grummond's cavalry trailed behind, catching up as Fetterman's infantry marched. By noon, lookouts on Pilot Hill signaled good news. The attack on the wood train had stopped, and the wagons were moving again, safe for now. But Fetterman's eyes were elsewhere. On the ridge ahead, he spotted 10 Lakota warriors, taunting his men, darting in and out of sight. They were bait, and Fetterman took it. Those 10 warriors weren't just random raiders. They were a decoy party, likely led by a young Lakota warrior named Crazy Horse, masters at luring soldiers into traps. Fetterman's force pushed forward, climbing toward the Bozeman Trail's crest on Lodge Trail Ridge. Then, something went wrong. Nobody knows exactly what sparked it. Maybe Grummond, with his history of chasing raiders, spurred his cavalry forward. Maybe Fisher and Wheatley, eager to test their fancy rifles, broke ranks. Or maybe the decoys were just too tempting. Whatever it was, the cavalry and mounted infantry charged down the north side of Lodge Trail Ridge straight into the jaws of hell. Near Pennow Creek, a mile from the ridge, the trap sprang. From ravines and ridges, 1,500 to 2,000 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Hunkpapa warriors surged forward, their war cries shattering the winter air. The soldiers were surrounded in seconds. Wheatley, Fisher, and about 10 others scrambled to some rocks at the base of a spur. Their Henry rifles blazed, spitting lead at a rate the Indians had never seen. Lakota accounts later said those rifles alone killed 60 to 100 warriors, a staggering toll, but it wasn't enough. The civilians' bodies were later found with dozens of spent cartridges around them, their rifles singled out for brutal mutilation after the fight. The cavalry, mostly raw recruits, panicked. They galloped south, hoping to reach the infantry, but Cheyenne and Hunkpapa warriors cut them off. Grummond fell near a hill, hacked down in the chaos. The infantry, trudging along the Bozeman Trail, never stood a chance. Lakota and Cheyenne closed in, wielding arrows, lances, and clubs. It was hand-to-hand slaughter. Chief American Horse later said he knocked a soldier, likely Fetterman, off his horse, stunned him, and cut his throat. Brown's body was found with a bullet in his temple, a self-inflicted wound, just as he'd vowed. In 40 minutes, all 81 men were dead, their bodies strewn across a mile-long spur north of Lodge Trail Ridge. Only a few had gunshot wounds. Most were killed by arrows or melee weapons, a testament to the ferocity of the fight. Back at the fort, the sound of gunfire hit like a gut punch. It started as a few pops, then exploded into a deafening roar. Carrington knew something was wrong. He sent Captain Tenador Ten Eyck with 40 men to find Fetterman. Ten Eyck, cautious to a fault, avoided Lodge Trail Ridge and took a safer eastern route to a knoll overlooking the battlefield. From there, he saw hundreds of warriors, shouting and waving weapons, daring him to come down. Fetterman's force was nowhere in sight. Ten Eyck sent a runner back to Carrington, reporting the enemy's strength. Carrington fired back an order. "Unite with Fetterman, fire slowly, keep your men in hand." He added a jab, noting Ten Eyck could have saved 2 miles by taking the ridge. By the time reinforcements arrived, the warriors had vanished, leaving only carnage. 81 bodies, stripped and mutilated, lay frozen in the snow. The Fetterman fight was over, but its fallout was just beginning. The sun rose on the 22nd of December, 1866, but Fort Phil Kearny was a ghost town of grief and fear. A howling blizzard swept in, piling snow against the stockade and trapping the survivors inside. The fort's ammunition was low, the horses were starving, and the nearest help was 235 miles away at Fort Laramie. Colonel Carrington knew they couldn't hold out long if the Lakota attacked again. He called for a volunteer to ride through the storm and get word to the army. John Phillips, a tough-as-nails scout nicknamed Portuguese, stepped up. With a borrowed horse and a buffalo coat, Phillips rode out into the blizzard, dodging Lakota scouts and battling frostbite. It was a suicide mission, but he made it. Staggering into Fort Laramie on Christmas night to deliver the news. His ride became legend, one of the gutsiest in frontier history. Back at Fort Phil Kearny, the mood was grim. The loss of 81 men, nearly a fifth of the fort's strength, was a gut punch the army couldn't ignore. By January 1867, the brass made their move. Carrington was relieved of command, replaced by Colonel John W. Smith. The army needed a scapegoat, and Carrington, the cautious colonel who'd never fought a battle, was the easy target. They pinned the disaster on him, saying he'd failed to control his officers and protect the fort. It was a harsh blow for a man who'd spent months building the outpost from nothing. Carrington wasn't going down without a fight. He knew the truth was messier than the army's story. He gathered witnesses to clear his name, starting with his wife, Margaret, and Frances Grummond, the pregnant widow of Lieutenant Grummond. Both women swore they'd heard Carrington give Fetterman strict orders, "Do not cross Lodge Trail Ridge." Frances, still reeling from her husband's death, backed Carrington up, saying she'd heard him repeat the order multiple times. Other survivors, including officers and enlisted men, confirmed it. The evidence was damning. Fetterman's entire command was found north of the ridge, exactly where Carrington had forbidden him to go. To Carrington, that was proof he wasn't to blame. He'd done his job, his officers hadn't. The fallen soldiers were another grim task. The bodies, frozen and mutilated, were recovered under heavy guard and buried in a mass grave at Fort Phil Kearny. It was a somber job, done in the shadow of more raids. Years later, in 1888, the remains were moved to Custer National Cemetery at the Little Bighorn battlefield, a final resting place for men who died in one of the Army's worst defeats. The graves were a stark reminder of the cost, but they didn't tell the whole story. The fight over who was to blame was just getting started, and it would reshape how history remembered the Fetterman Fight. The Fetterman Fight didn't just end with bodies in the snow, it sparked a battle over memory that's still debated today. In the years after the massacre, the story of what happened got twisted, and Captain William Fetterman became the fall guy. It started with the people closest to the tragedy, and their words carried weight. In 1868, just 2 years after the fight, Margaret Carrington, the colonel's wife, published a book called Absaroka, Home of the Crows. She painted a vivid picture of life at Fort Phil Kearny, but when it came to the Fetterman Fight, she had a clear agenda. Margaret described Fetterman as a gallant officer, brave and capable, but fatally flawed by overconfidence. She claimed he ignored her husband's orders, charging over Lodge Trail Ridge out of sheer ambition. Her book wasn't just a memoir. It was a defense of Henry Carrington, shifting the blame to Fetterman for the disaster. Margaret's words hit hard, especially since she was there, a first-hand witness with a knack for storytelling. The narrative got another boost in the 1870s when Frances Grummond, now Frances Carrington, added her voice. After losing her husband, Lieutenant Grummond, in the fight, Frances married Henry Carrington in 1870. Tying her fate to his, she wrote her own book, My Army Life and the Fort Phil Kearny Massacre, published in 1910 but based on her diaries from the 1860s. Frances praised Carrington as a steady leader and honored her first husband as a brave soldier. But Fetterman? She portrayed him as ambitious, eager to prove himself, and reckless enough to defy orders. Like Margaret, she insisted Carrington had done everything right, and Fetterman's disobedience was the real cause of the tragedy. With 2 women from the fort telling the same story, it started to feel like gospel. Both books leaned on a juicy detail. Fetterman supposedly boasted that a single company of soldiers could wipe out 1,000 Indians. It was a bold claim, the kind of bravado that made for a good story. But here's the catch. There's no hard evidence Fetterman ever said it. That kind of talk was common among young Army officers in the West, puffed up with confidence from the Civil War. Margaret and Frances pinned it on Fetterman, but no one from 1866, not a single soldier or officer, recorded him making that boast. It was a convenient way to paint him as arrogant, and it stuck. Then came the infamous 80 men quote. By 1908, decades after the fight, a new story surfaced. Fetterman had bragged he could ride through the entire Sioux Nation with just 80 men. Sound familiar? It matched the exact number in his doomed command. 78 soldiers and 2 civilians. The timing is suspicious. That quote didn't show up until 42 years after the battle, long after anyone who'd been at Fort Phil Kearny could challenge it. It's almost too perfect, like someone cooked it up to fit the body count. Think about it. What are the odds Fetterman predicted the exact number of men he'd lead to their deaths? More likely, it was a myth, crafted to make him look like a fool who got what he deserved. Another tale that grew legs was the suicide myth. Some stories claimed Fetterman and Brown, facing capture, turned their revolvers on each other, choosing death over surrender. It's a dramatic image, 2 officers making a final stand. But the evidence tells a different story. Brown's body was found with a self-inflicted gunshot to the temple, matching his earlier vow to die before being taken. Fetterman, though? The fort surgeon reported no gunshot wound on him. Chief American Horse said he killed Fetterman with a knife, and most of the soldiers were cut down by arrows or clubs. The idea of a mutual suicide pact was pure fiction, a romantic twist that made the story juicier but didn't hold up. Why did these stories take root? Fetterman was an easy target. He was an orphan, a bachelor with no wife or kids to defend his name. Unlike Carrington, who had Margaret and later Frances to fight for him, Fetterman had no one. His reputation was at the mercy of those with pens and grudges. Margaret and Frances weren't just writing books. They were building a legacy for their husbands. And Fetterman became the villain in their version of the truth. Their words shaped how newspapers, historians, and eventually the public saw the Fetterman Fight, turning a complex tragedy into a simple tale of one man's arrogance. But was it fair? That's the question that lingers as the dust settles on this bloody chapter. The Fetterman Fight wasn't just a single bloody day in Wyoming. It was a seismic event that rippled through history, leaving lessons we're still unpacking today. Right after the massacre, the U.S. Army didn't rush to bury Captain William Fetterman's name. In fact, they honored him. In July 1867, just 7 months later, they named a new outpost in eastern Wyoming Fort Fetterman. It was a nod to his bravery and service, a sign that the Army saw him as a fallen hero, not a reckless fool. That fort stood for decades, a reminder of a man who'd led men through the Civil War and died on the frontier. But that respect didn't last. By the early 20th century, the story had shifted. The books by Margaret Carrington and Frances Grummond, along with Henry Carrington's own interviews and writings, had taken hold. Historians, swayed by their accounts, started painting Fetterman as the poster boy for arrogance. They described him as a hot-headed officer, blinded by ambition, who ignored orders and led 81 men to their doom. The 80 men, quote, the boast about defeating 1,000 Indians, the suicide pact, all those myths from the books became accepted as fact. By the 1900s, the image of Fetterman as a reckless disaster was set in stone, etched into history books, newspaper articles, and even early Western films. Nobody was left to push back. The soldiers who'd served with Fetterman, who knew his skill and caution, were long gone. No witnesses survived to challenge the narrative, and with no family to defend him, Fetterman's reputation was left to rot. But the Fetterman Fight was more than a story of one man's mistakes. It was a turning point in the Plains Indian Wars. The Lakota and Cheyenne, led by warriors like Red Cloud and Crazy Horse, showed the world what they could do. Their ambush wasn't just a win, it was a masterclass in tactics. They used decoys, terrain, and overwhelming numbers to crush a well-armed U.S. force in under an hour. The defeat sent shockwaves through Washington. The Army, already stretched thin after the Civil War, realized they couldn't just bulldoze their way through the Powder River country. The Fetterman Fight, along with other Lakota victories, put pressure on the U.S. government to rethink its approach. They couldn't keep fighting forever. They had to talk. That pressure led to the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie. The U.S. agreed to abandon Fort Phil Kearny, Fort Reno, and Fort C.F. Smith, pulling out of the Bozeman Trail entirely. It was a rare win for the Lakota and Cheyenne. As soon as the Army left, Cheyenne warriors set Fort Phil Kearny ablaze, reducing it to ashes. The Powder River region, the heart of Lakota and Cheyenne territory, was theirs again, at least for a while. The treaty marked one of the few times the U.S. government backed down in the face of native resistance, and the Fetterman Fight was a big reason why. It showed the cost of underestimating tribes who were fighting for their way of life. The biggest lesson from the Fetterman Fight isn't about tactics or treaties, though. It's about truth, and how easily it can slip away. William Fetterman was a capable officer, a man who'd led soldiers through hell in the Civil War and trained green recruits to fight on the frontier. He wasn't perfect, but the evidence, from his own words about caution to the vague orders he got from Carrington, shows he wasn't the reckless braggart history made him out to be. Yet, because of a few well-placed stories, pushed by people with their own agendas, he became a cautionary tale of hubris. The Fetterman Fight teaches us to question the narratives we're fed, to dig for the facts beneath the myths. Left unchecked, a skewed story can become the truth, and a good man's name can be dragged through the mud. As we look back on that snowy ridge in 1866, we're left wondering, who else's story got lost in the telling?